Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the ACS webinar on preparing for Brexit, implications for convenience retailers. Thanks very much, everyone, for joining us. And we're delighted to have an expert panel to help us to unravel what might be happening over the next few months and what it means for our sector. So welcome to my colleague, Ed, our Government Relations Director. Welcome to David Thompson from FDF Scotland, who also looks after all of the Food and Drink Federation's Brexit preparations across the UK. And I'm going to introduce our panelist, but also our speaker, James Walton, Chief Economist at the IGD. And before we talk to Ed and to David and a bit more to James, to give us an introductory presentation to sort of set the scene and the framework for Brexit and how it might impact on our sector. And we can then unpack that even more in the discussion. So over to you, James. Thanks very much. Let's hear from you now.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that, James. Hello, everybody. I'm James Walton. I'm Chief Economist at IGD. And my role today is to try to set the scene for discussion of EU exit and what it might mean for convenience retailers in particular. I've got 10 slides to show you today. Hopefully, you can now see the first one. So, EU exit now starting to unfold against what has to be the worst possible economic and commercial background. Coronavirus has already tipped the UK into an absolutely savage recession. Food service, we know, has already suffered very badly from this, and it is likely that large parts of the food service sector are never going to be the same again. Food retail, well, actually, that's done a lot better. We know that value and volume sales up very, very strongly this year on year, although that doesn't necessarily mean people are making a lot more money, obviously. Within retail, convenience actually performing pretty well through the crisis, although it is clearly very dependent on where your stores happen to be. Town centre stores perhaps doing much less well than residential stores, for example. We also know that wholesalers and retailers did report some issues with stock allocation for certain products, at least early on in that crisis. And I think there is a real concern here that if we have more supply problems as a result of EU exit, could those stock allocation problems be repeated? If I move on to the second slide, hopefully you can now see that. EU exit itself as an agenda has moved on pretty quickly in the last couple of days. We've had the PM now indicating that for the first time, we absolutely should assume it's no deal and plan on that basis. And that's actually quite an important change for the government, because until quite recently, it was official policy that there would be a deal of some kind, even if it was a very basic kind of Canada style deal. So moving to this assumption that it's going to be no deal obviously changes the nature of the mission as far as officials are concerned. And there really isn't a lot of time for them to make that shift. You know, only 70 days now left remaining. And no deal also increases the likelihood that we are going to see adverse effects from exit within our own supply chain. And I think that those adverse effects will probably be manifesting in the form of, firstly, much greater cost, and secondly, in some cases, poorer availability. Now, if we look at the cost side, that's going to come from two broad sources: border friction and import taxes. So by friction, what I'm talking about are new admin tasks, complexity, delay, that sort of thing, anything increasing the cost of bringing goods over the border. And the import taxes, of course, are basically tariffs. At the moment, of course, we don't face any of those things because we're inside the customs union, inside the single market. But from January, it now seems we won't be, unless a last-minute trade deal comes through. And food and drink would be particularly affected by both of those things because we import a lot of it from the EU, it's complicated, and the UK tariff system is absolutely going to target food and drink itself. Now, the cost is quite hard to calculate, but could be really significant. And probably the best source we've got on this is this report here from LSE, which I believe was funded by our friends at Arla. This is just one table I've taken from it. And what it's doing here is giving us a breakdown of what EU exit might mean for food traders. So, for example, for unbranded fruit, the cost would be an additional 3% with a trade deal, or 10% with no trade deal. So the 3% is the cost of your additional friction. The 10% would be the border friction plus the tariffs that would apply. And because food and drink businesses run on such thin margins anyway, it would be really difficult to absorb cost changes like that in the supply chain. They would inevitably have to be passed on and would eventually be passed on, presumably, to shoppers, although not necessarily at once. It could be staged. Shoppers themselves, well, the good news is that they are benefiting from fairly low inflation at the moment, particularly for food and drink, but the pips are squeaking. And this chart here comes from some ONS research that came out last week. And that shows us that about 21% of households are already suffering. They're already seeing impacts on their household finances. And within that group, 14% are already spending less on food and drink as a response. And I think that is a sign of real financial hardship. That's probably 800,000 households with possibly millions of people living in them. So households already struggling and may well struggle more in future as a result of EU exit. But it won't necessarily be spread evenly across the UK. I think it would be concentrated in specific communities and specific demographics. Moving on, border friction, not only inflationary, of course, but also disruptive. And it's this potential disruption to movement over borders, which will impact availability. A lot is going to depend on the quality of preparation by businesses. And you may have heard in the last couple of weeks, various senior members of the government have been really questioning the quality of business preparation for exit. And I have to tell you that our own research, which I'm showing here, conducted over August and September, actually tended to support that view. So the big businesses that we spoke to, the senior people that we spoke to, only rated themselves in terms of border prep at about 6.5 out of a possible 10. May have improved in the last couple of weeks, but doesn't really fill you with confidence. We did ask why. What is getting in the way of Brexit prep? And yes, coronavirus was a big part of it, but the majority were really turning on government. They were saying it's lack of direction, lack of clarity from government, and particularly around Northern Ireland. In terms of government prep, our response only rated it about 4.5 out of 10. So what we can see here developing is a situation where businesses and government actually start blaming each other for any problems with availability associated with exit. Another thing that we uncovered in the research is a real lack of transparency on EU exit, even amongst businesses in the same supply chain. So businesses don't seem to be talking about this openly as a matter of course, and therefore very difficult to know whether whole supply chains are actually going to be ready. So EU exit expected to result in price increase, probably availability problems as well for food and drink. So what could actually be done? A few practical steps here. Firstly, of course, stock building may give some security against temporary supply chain disruption, although of course it is hard to do, particularly around Christmas time. Secondly, alternative suppliers, particularly for symbol operations where you tend to buy a lot of your goods or most of your goods from the same wholesale provider. Third, we've learned from COVID, and some people think COVID is a dress rehearsal for exit. We learned you've got to be flexible around your range and be ready to bring in alternative products if certain things run out. Fourth, most important, got to talk, got to use the time and effort, put in the hours to talk about Brexit. And if you're a convenience retailer, you've got to talk to your suppliers, got to talk to your wholesalers, even if these questions are really, really difficult. And finally, advocacy, which is obviously what bodies like ACS are here for. Looking ahead, well, we think convenience retail is going to grow fairly slowly over the course of the next couple of years. But even so, there will be about £19 billion worth of value growth between now and 2022, mostly from price change rather than from volume improvement. And of that, about 5 billion for convenience. There's lots of growth there to go for. In terms of shares, well, we think convenience retail is actually going to retain about the share it's got at the moment. So about 20% of the grocery market. So it's going to be stable, if you like, but other channels might actually shift. What I've got here is our future forecast for channel share in grocery retail. So the dark blue bar is 2019 shares. The light blue bar is our latest forecast for 2022, which takes account of COVID. The green is a previous forecast which didn't take account of COVID. And I've left that in so you can see what COVID has actually done. So you can see that we think COVID is going to accelerate the shrinkage of supermarkets and also accelerate the growth of online, essentially compressing and pressing ahead with trends that were already firmly in place. But overall, it's looking pretty solid in future for convenience, but there are challenges to overcome. The major ones in the short term would be EU exit and coronavirus, obviously. Longer term, other challenges are going to raise their heads. And I'm thinking things like portfolio optimization, health, sustainability, and interaction with online markets. Don't forget though, IGD, we are here to help you. We are a charity, and we've got lots of free research on all of these things, particularly nutrition and online and EU exit. So if you need any help, do think about us. And I'll stop there and I'll hand you back to James. Stop sharing.
Thank you. Stop sharing. Thank you very much indeed, James. That's brilliant, both in terms of outlining some of the issues with Brexit, but also reminding us that the convenience sector is not a bad place to be. And how often have we said that over the last couple of decades, really, and certainly right now. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Nonetheless, the convenience sector, like many businesses, is now facing into its second huge challenge in the space of 12 months. So how do we phase into that? So we'll come back to you, James, some more reflections, but looking really for some views and reflections on what James said. Firstly, from David, the work you're doing in terms of preparing the supply community for leaving the EU. What are the sort of conversations that your members are having with our members, with retailers at the moment? What's dominating that agenda at the moment?
Well, I think I would agree very much with the survey that James put up. So the survey of preparedness and how prepared can we be, both from a retailer, from a supplier, and indeed from those who supply ingredients into suppliers. So the types of conversation that we are telling people to have are very much along those lines. So it's about prepare for as much as you possibly can. Understand the border issues that there will be. Try and understand the new border IT systems. And when you're talking to your retailer, talk early, talk often, and understand that an enormous amount of this is still changeable. So it's interesting that the government preparedness thing was so low. It was 4.5, I think, in what James was saying. And we have a list of 170 odd outstanding questions that we've given to government about how this all works, to help our members prepare, to help food manufacturers prepare. And we've been promised an answer to, we've actually been promised an answer to those questions this week. And I will definitely, you'll know, James, if we get them. And that's the problem. So there are 170 different scenarios that might be slightly different as we wait there. And that's not just from import-export to EU, but obviously import-export to Northern Ireland, and in fact, how the whole system works.
That's very interesting. We haven't got 170 questions in this webinar, but we have a few, and also we could have 170 questions because anyone taking part has had a great response to this webinar. Please do put your questions in the chat facility, and I'll try to ask as many of those as possible. I've had some feedback on my chairing. I don't always manage to get all the questions across, but I shall try to do my very best. In fact, lots to come back to there, Dave. I don't want to move past that. But Ed, we're obviously working on various government groups and DEFRA and BEIS and elsewhere. What's the nature of those conversations? What's the agenda there? And how's that tallying with the questions that we're now getting from ACS members?
So I think there's a lot of consistency with the public message to the ones that are going on within the Department for Business and DEFRA that we're involved with, which is really around what James reflected on in his presentation around moving towards the sort of no deal scenario being the most likely one. So the messages are quite consistent. Obviously concern around all this uncertainty for retailers, and they're looking up their supply chains to try and get some reassurance around planning scenarios for what they can do. And I think we should encourage that as much as possible. I think the worst situation we can get to is really one where we stop communicating. I'm quite worried by the slides that James presented in terms of blame across government and blame across industry for not being prepared. We all need to be prepared. It's all in our economic interest to be prepared, so we need to sort of collaborate to do that. I think as David was saying, increasing awareness around the business operating model and really understanding what that means practically for retailers is really important. And I think there's a danger that we think that, okay, one of the certainties in this is the timeframes. So we're leaving at the end of the year, but actually the implications of the date of when we leave and the response from consumers and the impact on the supply chain is going to be very different. So I think consumers will respond earlier than the end of the year in terms of the exit, and if they decide to shop a bit more and stockpile a bit more, and then the impact on the supply chain, even looking at the government's reasonable worst case scenarios, are going to probably lag a little bit after that as well, not least because the operating model that the government proposed is phased across a 6-month period as well. So let's not just focus on that one date, let's focus on how it maps out over a longer period of time. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, it is a really, really important point. There's a risk that all these things that we zero in on one date and see that as the D-Day, and obviously it's more complex than that, as you said. So James mentioned a point, and I'll come back to you, James, and then I want to get view from David on this as well. James, you mentioned a point about the COVID experience, and some people have said, oh, well, had this dry run for Brexit with COVID. I'm not sure it's quite like that, is it? And obviously it's been a terrible time generally. Obviously, there's nothing good about it, but there's probably been an up and a downside in terms of what we've learned about our supply chains. It seems to me that on the one hand, consumer confidence in supply chains ought to be pretty strong because we've come through this period of time, and yes, there's some unusual consumer behaviour back in the spring, but actually what we've learned from this is the food supply chain is resilient. It does stand up, but against that, a lot of the retailers on this call will be saying that's all well and good, but I couldn't get lots of products that I needed back in the spring. Is the same going to happen now in a second wave of COVID? And is the same going to be happening in January and beyond in terms of the impacts of Brexit? So that's very much it turns into a question or not, James, but in terms of that sort of COVID as a precursor to Brexit, what have we learned, and what should we take from that in terms of our preparations going into Brexit?
Okay, well, I think in some ways you could argue we got lucky with the timing of coronavirus in that it happened before EU exit, and therefore the UK border with Europe remained open. So goods were able to continue flowing over the border in the usual way. Now, if it had happened a year later, or if we get a huge surge at some point in the new year, that border won't be fully open anymore, and therefore there's a fair chance that any supply problems that we have as a result will be aggravated. So, and in many ways, you could argue that the nightmare scenario is the intersection of COVID, EU exit, and probably Christmas as well. All those things kind of coming together at the same time. In terms of what we have got from COVID, what we have got is a certain amount of prestige and cachet for the grocery industry. We've been recognised as an effective, professional set of supply chains which are beneficial to the community. And according to our research, the prestige of food business has never been high. But can we hang on to that through EU exit as well, which will be a much tougher challenge? The key thing about stock allocation, I think, is going to be of huge interest to audience on this call, because of course we know that when stocks run short, as a manufacturer, you're going to say, well, I've got this much stock, I've got this many customers asking for it, I have to allocate it in the way that makes sense for me commercially. And it may well be that symbol groups, for example, or wholesale buying groups have to flex their muscles a little bit with manufacturers and say, look, we're big, powerful organizations as well. We want to be taken seriously as buyers. You've got to give us our fair share. Yeah.
David, James has outlined a tough set of situations there, which in that sort of perfect storm, and don't get all sort of negative because we've got to find a way through this. How worried should we be about those shortages coming into the convenience sector? How live an issue is that at the turn of the year?
Well, I think if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said, actually, the food and drink supply chain is strong. We've got through the worst of COVID. We've flexed, we've changed. We've gone from hospitality to selling things to people direct. We've got a whole range of different things, and we've dealt with the storm. I think the difference is that during the COVID crisis, you could use produce from the European Union, you could get that through green lanes facilitations, you could move things across borders in a way that is going to be more difficult when we get into this scenario. So James is absolutely right to say it's not the same. In the time that I've worked with food businesses, their resilience and their ingenuity is always very, very striking. But I think we should be worried. And I think the timing is difficult. Any timing was difficult. I'm pretty sure that the FDF has complained about every timing for EU exit that we've potentially had over the past couple of years. Disruption is going to be triggered by goods physically not arriving. Maybe that triggers more panic buying. For example, for Northern Ireland, there's a risk that goods are delayed or stop arriving from Great Britain. So, there's a whole range of different things where you'll need to have the right approvals, which you didn't have to have around COVID. You'll need to be able to understand the system, which you didn't understand, which wasn't a different system around COVID. So I would be concerned. What we're saying to members is make sure that you're having these conversations, you're discussing them with everyone who you supply to, you're making sure that arrangements are in place to make sure that you've got stuff in the right place at the right time. Beyond that period, and reduce the pressure, in particular around that 31st of December, 1st of January date. But Ed's also right to say that consumer buying patterns will be impacted before the 1st of January, and actually in the weeks after, as you see what is and is not available. And I think the one thing that came out of COVID that we all saw was that when people perceived a product to not be available, that's the kind of thing that triggered their behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the other things we saw around that time was pressure on our sector in terms of price and awareness around price. James put up a very quite a stark slide there about the impact of the price impact of friction and of tariffs. Ed, if we're how do we handle that as a sector? How do you handle that as a retailer where you're then offering prices that have quite significantly gone up in quite a short period of time due to those factors? How do we handle those issues as retailers with our customers?
Well, I think first of all, we need to familiarise ourselves with the UK global tariff and make sure we're clear about the products most clearly going to be impacted, because that's going to happen as a result of no deal. That's a certainty. The UK global tariff is out there and included within our Brexit readiness briefing, which is on the website now, so you can link to that. I also think, again, it's about communication down to the customers about those products that will be impacted and the price changes that will happen at the earliest possible opportunity. That's practically possible without sparking off unnecessary sort of activity. But again, that is all precursored by being able to talk to your wholesaler, your supplier, and understand the impacts on those individual products and the prices. But early communication with your customers and open communication, I think, is the key thing there.
Yeah, that's a great bit of advice. David, come back to you now. I'll come to James on the same question. Which product lines and product categories and areas should our members be most concerned about? Which ones are they to be? And I appreciate it's difficult because some of none of your members in those categories want to be associated with this sort of disruption, but there are some that are going to be more risk of disruption and more risk of higher tariffs, which James has talked about. What should we be having on our sort of red, amber, green list of categories? What should be maybe in the red for that looking ahead?
Well, I think that's very clear without having to name businesses. It's very clear because of the additional paperwork that's required. So it's very, and also the additional time that's required. So for the additional paperwork that's required, you're talking about export health certification and so on. So what we're talking about is, animal and plant products. So things like mince, things like steaks, and so on. They're the kind of things where there will be an additional burden on manufacturers and the supply chain. So that, I think, is likely to be a specific set of issues. And then the second element is where elements have a short shelf life. So if there are delays on any border or for delivery or with paperwork, then we would be very clear that it's items with a short shelf life which are going to be most at risk of shortage or delay.
Okay, that's a good basis. James, anything to add to that?
So the things I would add is that as we've moved to the UK global tariff, a lot of things that we buy as consumers are actually not going to be tariffed anymore. So we are seeing tariffs being dropped in quite a lot of areas, but they are being retained in those areas that are seen as being defensive interests for the UK. So that's primarily cars, chemicals, and obviously food. And there's been a deliberate policy of focusing food tariffs on protein and dairy, because those are seen as essential strategic interests for UK agriculture. Obviously, I don't think there's a lot that we can do at this point about the tariffs, which have now been essentially signed off and are in place. But in terms of some of the other costs associated, what we might see is businesses, for example, bringing in bigger shipments. So rather than bringing in 2 trucks twice a week, you might bring in 1 truck once a week, fill it up, and therefore only do 1 set of paperwork and 1 set of admin. So but that would mean a bit of a change in the way we run our supply chains, which are often very much small shipments delivered frequently.
Yeah, well, especially convenience. I mean, we're based on, low quantity. That's sort of how we work. David, I want to come back to you to talk about particularly some issues within the United Kingdom. So particularly in terms of Northern Ireland, particular differences there. How different is trade going to be for retailers in Northern Ireland and manufacturers trading and shipping through Northern Ireland at the moment? And is this the biggest single impact we should be looking ahead to, or has this been overblown in some of the media coverage?
Unfortunately, we don't think it has been overblown. We think that there are significant issues, and we work very closely with our colleagues in the Northern Irish Food and Drink Association on this. There are a whole set of issues, in particular for those who are importing into Northern Ireland, which will be difficult to deal with because there are a different set of labelling requirements, there are a different set of composition requirements potentially, as it's European legislation that will be in place there. And so for many of our members, they've expressed significant concerns about trading into Northern Ireland, and at least until the dust settles and it becomes clear what's required. So for us, there is a huge issue there because you've got the dual legislations that you need to do. And actually coming out of Northern Ireland, it may be slightly easier, but the big issue there is what defines a Northern Irish business. And so if you're reliant on a food manufacturer who manufactures in Northern Ireland, they should have unfettered access to the rest of the United Kingdom, but we don't yet know how they're going to define what a food manufacturer in Northern Ireland is. So if you're a convenience store in Northern Ireland, I think there is significant issues. And the government has said already that it will support supermarket supply chains into Northern Ireland, but not in the other sectors. So for us, there is a big question actually about how this is all going to work into Northern Ireland.
Yeah, Ed, what's your perspective on that specifically? I know we've worked with FDF and others on lobbying on this. How do you see that risk for Northern Irish retailers?
Yeah, well, it really all comes down to how we're defining at-risk products going into Northern Ireland and how that's secured within the supply chain to determine if they could get more preferential treatment at a border. So a trusted trader scheme essentially for moving products into Northern Ireland, and that is a good solution. It means people that can actually sign off consignments going into Northern Ireland at their distribution centres. Good solution. I suppose the challenge is why have we got to a point where we're not allowing everyone to take advantage of that scenario, particularly the convenience sector, who very clearly serving communities in a different way and a much greater established part of the grocery market in Northern Ireland as well. So I think our message to the government has been with all of this that we have to open this up. We have to include it to convenience retailers because let's get moving. It's a good solution. It can work. Why not be more inclusive? And we're told that there is lots of progress in terms of technical conversations, but of course it's all subject to conversations in the joint committee. So we don't really know. And I think you have to be careful about who says they know exactly what's happening when, because there's a very small number of people that actually do know what happens, and they'll decide to tell us exactly what is happening when they want to. But being inclusive for that, I think, is really important for Northern Ireland and for the convenience sector and our suppliers as well.
And you're right. I mean, the Northern Irish market is particularly a good one in the convenience store sector. You just have to look at award programs and see who wins them. And also, it struck me from going to see the market there is how that's a market that relies and draws on supply chains and support from mainland GB, but also very much from the Republic of Ireland, and they're going to be at that sort of pinch point, aren't they? And the challenge is, how does that become a virtue rather than the burden? Ed, I want to stick with you because we talk about communication, message from everyone. Communication is really important. It needs to be talking now. What's a sort of template for a conversation between a retailer and their wholesaler at the moment? What are the questions that a retailer should be asking of their wholesaler at the moment?
I suppose it's planning scenarios for different timeframes that are coming up over the months. So obviously there's the Christmas period, and directly after that, in terms of deliveries to store, how they're handling the conversations up the supply chain with their suppliers and the operating model, and really trying to get a sense of what they have in place already. I also think for some retailers, it's going to be important to think about regionality and the impact on different regions. We're going to have some parts of the operating model in place will obviously affect Kent and other port areas that will prevent lorries going into those locations, and will potentially have a big impact on traffic. So if you're in one of those areas, then you're going to have to be asking questions of your wholesaler about how you're going to get that supply in to that location and continue to supply the store, because there'll be knock-on effects to that. So it's very, very practical. I think some of the questions we've had here about product lines they expected to be impacted, and also your own plans to communicate this to your customers, and perhaps reflecting on the 83% of retailers that are affected during COVID from lack of supply, how they're looking to work with other suppliers as well to mitigate that. So I think there's lots of questions, wasn't it? But I think it's an open conversation about what you're doing at retail level to communicate with customers and mitigate it yourself, but also really understanding what conversations you're having up the supply chain about the operating model.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because one of the things that I think helped our sector in the spring was that we have a diversity of supply routes, and we found some more supply routes, and all the examples you've heard on webinars like this and elsewhere about retailers finding maybe local suppliers who traditionally serve food service and then have lost that market overnight, but then the retailers are able to work with them, lifeline for those suppliers really, but also obviously get products into their store. Perhaps there were some challenges with supply from their traditional normal suppliers. So that breadth of supply is very important as well. James, can I come on a bit to, and you talked about with your different channels and how they would be faring after COVID. And after this being so, and I suppose that what's determining the height of those bars on that graph you showed? What's determining that is consumer choice, how are consumers behaving? How do you think that the EU exit might change customer behaviour, sort of short term, but maybe slightly into the longer run? What channels are they be looking to use more or less? What products might they be looking for more or less? Is that total crystal ball, or is that something we can start to see some some ideas about what might happen there?
Right. Well, I think the first thing we've got to recognise is that an awful lot of shoppers are going to start 2021 in a very, very hard place indeed. They'll be contending with low wage growth, inflation, possibly redundancy, and an enormous sense of fear. And I think we have to recognise that the fear and the concerns that our shoppers express are actually not unreasonable. They're probably perfectly well informed and right to be worried. So that, I think, is the first thing that will determine what should be happening in convenience stores. So perhaps convenience stores need to move towards, lower priced basics, away from convenience products, away from premium priced products, maybe even away from meal solutions completely, in terms of giving a better value, lower priced basket to support shoppers who are really, really struggling. But as we look further ahead, I think there are going to be opportunities out there as well. And we have to recognize that certainly COVID has brought a lot of changes to the way we live, the way we use our communities, and the way we work as well. And a lot of shoppers are going to retain those lifestyle changes even after the virus threat goes away. So I think there will be opportunities there for serving people who are working from home, for example, getting that meal out of the workplace canteen back into the home. What do we do with that? And the other big opportunity will be meshing properly with online. Hitherto, I think a lot of convenience retailers have struggled to understand what their role is within a digital marketplace. Some have pushed ahead, and I think particularly people like the Co-op have done really well in terms of meshing with Amazon, meshing with Starship Technologies, and so on. But other convenience operators are going to have to catch up and say, well, how do we capture orders? How do we shape people's preferences in a digital marketplace? And can we form the right strategic partnerships and alliances to help us meet customers in the digital space? Yeah. Because the digital high street will be just as important as the actual high street in the future.
Very interesting. So there's a very long conversation. I'm not going to go down there, but about how I think our sector has its history is actually about how we pick up and trade in declining areas, and areas that have had their specialist retailers or specialist outlets have been hit. And I think that's exactly what we might see playing out in food service. And I was very struck by how Pret, with all the concern about returning to central London and other major centres and footfall, their response was to say, well, we need to have a footprint in those other places, other locations where people are going to be having their lunch now and having their breakfast and having coffee and so on. And that to me is an opportunity for our sector. But anyway, I won't go down there because it's a whole other webinar that frankly no one wants to hear any more from me about. Ed, can I come back to you to talk a bit about, well, actually Ed first and then to David, about just operations really, the sort of store operations and how EU exit might change those store operations, issues around colleagues, issues around service and delivery, issues around regulation on certain products. That's a huge topic, but what are the things that we should be particularly thinking about in that space, Ed? And I'll come to you with a similar question on those regulatory issues for suppliers, David, in a moment. So Ed, store operations and EU exit.
I think the first thing is obviously store colleagues and making sure that they're briefed around what's coming and understand all the changes that we've been discussing so that they can communicate that to customers is really important. We've also seen that whenever there's big social or economic change, that can often cause friction in stores and challenges in stores. And we've seen that in COVID. We really need to be mindful of that and support them to manage with that and diffuse situations as much as possible. So starting with colleagues is key. I think the other store operation element, which James mentioned in his presentation, was around potential for stockpiling. I think there's a real challenge for convenience retailers to stockpile in their stores. They, the sites are small. I think very few, only about 1 in 4, actually have space to do any additional stockpiling in stores. But it is worth thinking about where you can do that, or how you will manage those situations. I think the other operational element that's concerning people at the minute is around the tobacco supply chain, particularly around the tobacco track and trace scheme, which is currently in place, currently the result of an EU directive, and therefore that whole system links with an EU IT system. As of the point where we leave, there will be a UK system that will replace that. So for lots of retailers that are moving product through their wholesale supply chain or between retail premises, will have to reapply up to the UK scheme, and that will take time and that will take effort. Unfortunately, it's not as easy as the update on your Windows system. There's a lot of investment in making that happen in a short space of time, and then that becomes doubly complicated when you add in the Northern Ireland element, because retailers that are moving tobacco into that into that location will then have to share information to both schemes. So you'd be applying information to the EU scheme and the UK scheme. So there's a big operational challenge there. I mean, the main thing for most retailers, if you're not moving product between premises or at a wholesale level, you don't have to do anything. Your unique operating codes stay the same. But for your wholesalers and for integrated supply chains, that is going to be a big challenge. And again, another question to add to the list, James, of things we should talk to our suppliers about. What are we doing in this space to manage the tobacco supply, which has gone up significantly at this period of time because of less people travelling and duty-free and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, starting with colleagues, thinking about in-store operations in terms of stockpiling, but then also that tobacco supply chain is going to be, there's going to be some fast action on operations in that in the next few months.
Okay, great. David, what's on top of the your members, big suppliers, sort of ops directors list in relation to this?
Yeah, I think there's an element of similarity there in some of those areas. So range changes, we saw that around COVID, of course, as well, where people maximised some ranges and minimised other ranges, and actually in manufacturing that's still playing out as factories change what they're doing to become COVID secure and maintain that status. So there's been a lot of flexibility in ranges recently, and I would expect that in particular where there are issues around labelling or certification or ingredients, then there may well be a whole set of range changes either in the types of products or in the composition of those products. So that's one thing to be aware of. I think the point about stockpiling and cost changes are going to be where the store staff take the brunt of this. So if there are additional tariffs, if there are costs through the additional procedures, then at some point the consumer is going to have to pay for that. And unfortunately, it's quite often the retail staff that have to explain that to the consumer. And I think there is likely to be a change in the costs of at least some goods as a result of these changes, and of course the availability in particular over key points running up to Christmas and after that period. I think the other thing to note, I think, is around labelling, in particular in Northern Ireland, but actually across the whole of the UK. There is number one in Northern Ireland going to need to be joint labelling, and within the rest of the UK. Then there may well be a shift in SKUs and the way that they approach that. So looking for changes in packaging and changes in approach is quite likely. And I think just to go back to the Northern Ireland point, I think you will see a consolidation as a number of smaller ranges fall out of profitability in Northern Ireland. So there will be less range availability as things go forward, I think. Concomitant to that on labelling, there's a whole range of potential changes around, for example, organic certification, protected geographical indicator, all of the things which are quite niche, but do mean a lot to some people. And I think keeping an eye on when the European organic label changes, or keeping an eye on when the protected geographical indicator changes, may be really important to some customers in some stores. So, there's a lot of change.
There's a lot. That's things like labelling is things perhaps, I'm not saying we don't have to worry about as retailers, but it's a secondary issue for us, but obviously top of the agenda for many of your members. I've had a specific question I'll put to James before I do sort of a bit of a wrap up bits at the end. The quick fire section, which is becoming a standard of ACS webinars, very, very good. But James, I've had specific questions about the beer and wine category, the off-license category. What sort of specific changes can we expect in that category for our sector coming through leaving the EU?
Oh Lord. Well, clearly there will be new arrangements specific to all excised goods for the post EU exit period, and therefore people may for the first time have to get used to there's a specific scheme for moving excised goods from one place to another. The name of it currently escapes me, but you will have to apply for moving these goods for recognition under the scheme for moving these goods around in the post-exit period. Now, for convenience retailers, I'm not convinced that's something that all of them will necessarily have to deal with themselves. It will be dealt with higher up the supply chain. But as we look into 2021, again, we've got the question of, can shoppers really afford to splash out on beers and wines and spirits in the same way as before? And secondly, what about policy development on the part of government? Because behind all of this, policy development on the government side is going to continue into 2021 and the years beyond that. We've already had a shot across the bows with the National Food Policy, and they told us very firmly in part one, more coming. And what's coming is more aggressive policy on health. And therefore, I think we can expect more activity intended to drive down the consumption of alcohol, if only because it's calories, which will be going onto our waistlines. So more activity, even if we don't know what it looks like. And given the state of government finances, the most tempting policy approach may well be more tax. Simply because it reduces consumption and raises revenue at the same time. So it'd be quite a hard one for the Chancellor to resist, I suspect. So if I was a gambling man, that's where I'd put my money.
It's very interesting, actually, alcohol policy, which I said is that many years ago, it's all about antisocial behaviour. And now it's sort of come around to be much more of a general diet health issue, if you like, and that's the lens it's being seen through, which is interesting. So yes, the ever popular quick fire round we're doing now. So I'm going to come to I'm going to start James, David, Ed on this very quickly. First quick fire question, as close as you can to a one-word answer. Will the UK leave with a deal at the end of the transition period, at the end of the year?
Most likely, no. Plan on that basis.
David?
Plan on the basis of no, but there's likely to be some kind of deal.
Okay. Ed?
Plan on the basis of no deal. I think there will be a very thin deal. I think it's in everyone's interest to get a deal.
Okay. Again, same order. Start with you, James. The one biggest negative impact, the one thing that's keeping people awake at night in terms of that we're going to feel. What's the big ticket item that's going to cause most pain in this industry?
I think it's got to be fresh fruit and veg, imported from Europe, delayed at the border, rotting on the dock.
Okay. David?
That plus fish leaving us and rotting on the dock. Okay.
A couple of things rotting. Ed?
So yeah, availability, I think, is the big challenge, the big issue.
Okay. And another, this is the other way around, a positive that's going to come out of UK leaving the EU. Quick, just one. Don't list all of them, obviously, but James, just pick out one positive.
Okay, I think the really positive one from a food point of view is the fact that we'll be able to make policy on things like agriculture, plastics, that sort of thing, specific to the UK and ideally fine-tuned to our conditions, as opposed to something compromised for the whole continent.
Yeah, great answer. David?
I think the hope is a government that is more in tune with listening to industry. That's a hell of a hope at the moment, though.
Okay. Ed?
I think for the national food strategy, it gives us a good grounding for collaboration across the supply chain, and perhaps a look forward on what's important in our food supply chain in the future.
Okay, brilliant. And therefore, the final quick fires tend to leave with just one bit of key advice for retailers, wholesalers, suppliers. I'll start with you, James. Maybe advice, particularly for wholesalers, particularly for people shifting the goods around and dealing with a wholesale sense. What was key advice for them?
Talk to your suppliers, talk to your retailers, because 4 years ago people weren't talking about Brexit. They're still not talking about it now. Talk.
Okay. Great one, David. Key advice for suppliers in particular.
Yeah. So the key thing here is get as many answers to those questions as possible. And for the love of goodness, get stuff shipped over one border or the other before the 31st of December.
Okay. Ed, last word to you. Keep advice for retailers.
Watch your inbox for more updates from ACS on this, because we're going to give you a lot more information around key things and key conversations you need to have with up and down the supply chain and with your colleagues as well. That's
brilliant. Thank you very much, James. Thank you, Ed. Thank you, David. That was really instructive and useful. I learned a lot myself, and hopefully the many people we've had on this call have as well. I think I've not been too bad today about asking the questions that have come through as best I can, which I don't always say. So I've tried to reflect some of those in the conversation. But if anyone has asked a question that hasn't been addressed, let us know. We'll try and address that, maybe through a blog or through answering on the website or directly to you. If there's questions that come to mind after the event, you think, I wish I'd asked that question, again, please come through. And we'll do our best to come up with a good answer. And finally, to just echo Ed's advice there, keep a close eye on the information we're putting out, and organisations and friends in the industry like IGD, like FDF, who are, everyone's working very hard to supply the best information we can. So please talk to your supply chain partners. Also talk to us, talk to your trade organisations to see what help we can provide. And if it's a challenge for you, it's probably a challenge for many other businesses as well. So we really want to hear from you. So thank you again, James, David, and Ed.
Cheers.